everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our topic 8.8, which is all about bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So here the definition of bioaccumulation is the selective absorption as well as concentration of elements or compounds by cells in that living organism, most commonly that are fat-soluble compounds. So remember, this is why in our discussion on persistent organic pollutants, we mentioned that those types of pollutants that fall under that category tend to be persistent because they are hydrophobic, right? They don't easily dissolve in water, but they can easily dissolve in the fat tissues of organisms. Now, what is then biomagnification? This is the increase in that concentration of substances per unit of body tissue as we move up in trophic level within a food chain or within a food web. We know from our biomagnification activity, primary consumers, bottom feeding fish, zooplankton, insects, we know are going to take in pops that might be found on maybe small microplastics. That wind up on the producers or autotrophs in that given environment, causing that bioaccumulation of pops in the tissues of those zooplankton. We know that secondary consumers, like in our activity, which were fish like sardines, we know that they're going to eat those primary consumers and once again take in the pops in their tissues. And because of that unit one topic, right, the 10% rule, as we move up in trophic level, we know only about 10% of the energy will be transferred between those levels and 90% gets lost as heat. We know that as we move up those levels, organisms are going to have to consume more and more prey in order to survive, leading to higher levels of POPs in their systems over their lifetimes. And so large predators like salmon or dolphins and whales may even have the highest amounts of persistent organic pollutants or even mercury levels found in their tissues. Now, it's important to note not only do persistent organic pollutants accumulate in the tissues of living organisms, but mercury can also. Now, we talked about mercury being a neurotoxicant. It can also be a teratogen. We know that it winds up coming from the burning of fossil fuels or even a volcanic eruption. We know mercury, when it's in the atmosphere, could potentially be carried by wind and deposited in water, wherever bacteria can actually convert it into an even more toxic form, and that form is called methyl mercury. Methylmercury can be taken in by phytoplankton and once again be biomagnified at higher trophic levels. When we see it biomagnified, we can see that it has the potential to affect the central nervous system of the animals that it is accumulating in. Human exposure to methylmercury and POPs from eating large predatory fish can have potential detrimental effects to our nervous system, especially if you are a pregnant woman. We can see issues with the developing fetus and disruption with reproductive systems. Now, another common chemical pollutant, which we know falls under the classification of a POP, is the pesticide known as DDT. DDT was banned in many developed nations, but because it doesn't easily break down in the environment, it can actually still persist in some sediments and even some bodies of water. We know that it can be taken in by bottom feeders, zooplankton, and once again, be biomagnified at higher trophic levels. Now, what kind of organisms did DDT affect the most? We actually saw it affect bird species, specifically eagles or even osprey. How did DDT affect these organisms? Well, we know that eagles or osprey tend to wind up being the top predator in their food chain or food web. So we know that the concentration of DDT is going to have its magnified effects. We saw actually a thinning of the eggshells of those organisms, which then dropped their reproductive rates drastically, which then was linked to a massive population decline of bald eagles in the US, which then prompted the Endangered Species Act in 1973. Now, two laws that pertain to water that you 100% need to know is the Clean Water Act that was first established in 1972. It's important to note that the Clean Water Act is what helps to support the protection, propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife associated with water. So, water quality issue standards are defined by the EPA under then the Clean Water Act. So, it's important to note that the Clean Water Act mainly deals with water or aquatic ecosystems and their health, versus the Safe Drinking Water Act is what actually sets the national standards for safe drinking water for humans. So it is responsible for establishing what's called the maximum contaminant levels for lots of different elements and substances. We're going to actually test those today in our water quality lab, and you will research some of the maximum contaminant levels of those elements that are safe for drinking water. So, just to give you a little overview, looking at the maximum contaminant levels in drinking water established by the EPA in parts per billion, we can see here are a couple of microorganisms. So, as you can see, the maximum contaminant level should be zero of fecal coliform, Giardia. But notice how levels of arsenic can actually reach about 10 parts per billion and it still be considered safe drinking water at that point. Right here we can see with mercury, as long as it remains to and under the maximum contaminant level of parts per billion found in the water, it is considered to be safe drinking water. Here in this table displays to us the current leading causes and sources of any impaired waterways in the US. So we can find streams and rivers tend to be plagued by bacterial pathogens, habitat alteration, oxygen depletion, right, the levels of DO and BOD as a result of agriculture, changing the flow of water, or even dam construction. Lakes, ponds, and reservoirs we can see can be pools for mercury, PCBs, which we know are POPs, endocrine disruptors, and nutrients like nitrogen and phosphates. Bays and estuaries, which are more likely located near ocean ecosystems, can also be plagued by bacterial pathogens, oxygen depletion, and mercury. Guys, that is it for our video on 8.8. And so far, we've now made it through the half point of Unit 8. So now we have wrapped up water pollution.